Hey guys, I'm Chuck here with the 10 best video game consoles ever. I'm hoping for better ratings this time because of one simple logic. It's a lot easier to agree than to disagree. And remember, it's just opinions and a video made for fun. Death threats are not necessary. Without further ado, let's start this thing. Number 10 on our list today is the Game Boy Color for pioneering two major concepts. It was really one of the first portable systems to ever make it over well. There were ones before that had big games built in the Game Boy, but neither of those really succeeded. The Game Boy Color was the first to really start selling units that weren't hooked up to a TV. The other good thing it pioneered was compatibility. We've seen many systems such as the Atari 5200 fail because of their lack of it. The Game Boy Color could play its predecessor's games, the Game Boy. It had a good battery life, little competition, and was an overall really good system. Number 9 is the ColecoVision. It had quite a few interesting features, such as being able to play the competition's games with the 2600 converter, and it was one of the first systems to ever have over 1 million units sold. Coleco actually got to make the game Donkey Kong for all three systems, the ColecoVision, Intellivision, and 2600, something it purposely sabotaged the R2 and made its Donkey Kong great. It also had over 125 titles. Number 8 on our list today is the PSP. Now I know what you're thinking. PSP? What? The games on that are terrible. As much as it is so, games don't make up 100% of a system, and the other percent of the PSP was enough to far make up for the games. The PSP did have quite a few good games, mostly strategies such as Final Fantasy Tactics, and the even better Joan of Arc. The PSP was mostly filled with failed console adaptations, such as Dungeon Siege and Battlefront. They both tried to make games, but both were pretty crappy. So what makes the PSP so great? Features. It could play MP4 video, it could play songs, it can do pretty much everything an iPod can. A lot of Nintendo fanboys are screaming at the screen right now, DSi Nubcake! The PSP came out far before the DSi and had so many of the features. The internet browser is fast and free, and the MP3 player is built right in, along with the MP4 player. It also had its games coming in armored discs called UMDs. They put discs on a handheld. This was something Nintendo thought impossible, thus why the DSi is still sticking with cartridges. What really makes PSP shine is its homebrew. DS has a bit, sure, but it doesn't even have a USB port. How the heck do you even get that stuff on there? With homebrew made from many throughout the world, you can play the old school Mario, Mario 64, any PlayStation game, Atari 2600 games, program your own game, Pong, movies, whatever. You can get it all free on your PSP. Gotta look out for those viruses though. Number 7 on the list today is the Atari 2600. Game systems didn't sell very well back in the 70s, partly thanks to the Magnavox Odyssey's crappy advertising campaign, but they sure started to after the Atari 2600 came out. Every developer was porting games to the 2600. Atari barely even made any. However, greedy companies, which ruin everything, saw they could profit off the 2600. Suddenly Kool-Aid Man had a game, along with many other of your favorite mascots, thus making gaming crap and killing the 2600, along with all the other game systems. If it weren't for this, the 2600 would be a lot higher on the list. But the Nintendo came along later and gave gaming the jolt it needed to get up and become what it is today. Number 6 on the list is the PS1. It was a great system and one of the first to use CDs other than the Philips CDI. It was ironically formed off the Super Nintendo CD. It was originally going to be an add-on, but then Sony decided to make their own system when Nintendo turned on them and went with Philips, which also created the CDI. There was a huge selection of games you could play, and the PlayStation had a great controller. One thing that's only been replicated by a third-party company for the GameCube to date was an LCD screen you could attach to your system and play the games on. Sony came up with this idea originally for the PlayStation 1, and they did release it, but at a hefty price, it didn't sell very well. But that does make the PlayStation 1 the first home and mobile console ever. Number 5 on our list is the Nintendo 64. It was a great system made by Nintendo to compete with the PlayStation 1. It had some awesome games and was one of the first to go 3D. Stuff like StarCraft 64, Mario 64, Harvest Moon 64, most of the old series that were successful ported over to the N64 and went 3D. One bad thing about the system was everything had 64 in its title. Just look at 10 games for the system. I bet you 9 out of 10 will have 64 in the title. The controller must have been made for someone with 3 hands. The one edge PlayStation 1 had over N64 was that it was using CDs instead of N64's cartridges. CDs give you a lot more storage space for better graphics and longer games. The successor to the Game Boy Color, it had full compatibility with both the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, a huge library of its own games. Its sales were extremely high and had the longest battery life to date.
You got it right, it's the Game Boy Advance, coming in at number 4.
Nintendo also took the liberty of releasing some revamped Super Nintendo and NES classics that turned out pretty well, actually. The Game Boy Advance is so great, it's still selling today, with the release of the DS, the DS Lite, and the DSi. Number 3 on our list is the Nintendo Entertainment System. One thing that was great about the Nintendo was how it saved gaming after the crash from 2600. They brought about something called ROB, the Robotic Operating Buddy, and sold the system as a robotic entertainment system. Once Nintendo had an established base and was sold throughout America, they ditched ROB and started releasing great games like Mario, Metroid, Zelda, all that. Nintendo experimented with many different ideas for the NES, such as the Power Glove. Most ended up failing. However, some went over well, such as the Nintendo Satellite allowed you to have 4 players, and even rumors of let you have play with other people throughout the world, essentially starting the online community. Take that, Dreamcast. One bad thing about the NES is its huge concentration of movie games. They all suck. No one wants them, but yet they sold somehow. Such as Jaws and, all that stuff that nobody wants to buy. My last problem with the Nintendo is 15 years later, if you get one, you're going to have to get a Nintendo cleaning kit and invest some money in the thing to even get it to work. Yellow screen syndrome and dirty cartridges have taken over almost every system, are nearly inoperable for more than 3 minutes if you don't clean it regularly. This is because Nintendo put their cartridges in from the side instead of up top like the other systems, making it more susceptible to damage and dirt. Number 2 is the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as the SNES. The Super Nintendo went straight out and straight forward. Less movie game releases were allowed, there were no more dumb accessories like the Power Glove, and it worked 100% of the time. The games were great, the controller fit your hand better, and the cartridges went in on the top. Although it was released nearly 2 years after its competitor, the Sega Genesis, it still managed to win the console war for that year. Amazing.
Number 1 on our list today is the Sony PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 was, of course, the successor to the PlayStation, also an awesome system. The PlayStation was one of the first to play music CDs. The PS2 was the first to play DVDs. A smart idea that was later copied by Xbox, but GameCube couldn't copy it because of their idiotic disc size. Today, 8 years later, the PlayStation 2 is still selling. All the games have awesome graphics, the library is well over 1,000 games, and it can outdo the sales of the Wii, Xbox 360, and PS3 combined. The PlayStation 2 is a fun, cheap, and affordable system that is really just great and deserves all those sales. It could play PlayStation 1 games, had huge amounts of memory compared to the last memory card on the PlayStation 1, and online games were free after you bought the adapter. The only real downsides I can think of for this great system are you have to really buy everything, such as the online adapter, the 4 controller slots, all the memory cards. Sony really, you could tell, wanted money with this, even though it was a great system and they paid attention to it. Also, sometimes it fails to read PlayStation 1 discs and gives you this red screen of death thing. Other than that, the Sony PlayStation 2 is the perfect system in every way.
Thanks for watching my review. Stay tuned to see the most overrated and underrated games of all time.